All right, welcome to Taste the Robot. This is going to be my last video of the series on Latin America. This last video is going to be about Venezuela, what's currently going on in Venezuela, partly about what's happened in Venezuela before, like almost 20 years ago in 2002, but 99% of it is going to be about what's going on right now. So this is going to be a longer video. It's a longer video because this is what the series of videos has been leading up to. I think this is another coup in Latin America, at least I think, brought on by the United States, and it takes on many similarities to those which have happened before in Latin America. So this, if it is a coup, would not be the first against the Chavista regime in Venezuela. A quote from a 2002 Guardian article, quote, officials at the Organization of American States and other diplomatic sources, talking to the Observer, assert that the U.S. administration was not only aware of the coup, or aware the coup was about to take place, but had sanctioned it and presumed it would be destined for success. The Observer and the Guardian reported on the close ties between senior officials in the U.S. government, and those same senior officials already had, quote, dirty war pasts from the 1980s. One of those men was Otto Reich. According to the 2002 article, Reich is a right-wing Cuban American who, under Reagan, ran the Office for Public Diplomacy. It reported in theory to the State Department, but Reich was shown by congressional investigations to report directly to Reagan's national security aide, Colonel Oliver North, in the White House. Another one of those men was, you may know his name, Elliot Abrams, who, quote, who gave a nod to the attempted Venezuelan coup. And that's from the Guardian article in 2002. He misled Congress about Nicaragua with the Iran-Contra and ran his policy of, quote, hemispherism, according to the article, which, quote, led to the coup in Chile in 1973 and the sponsorship of regimes and death squads that followed it in Argentina, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and elsewhere. And funny, I didn't know all these countries I talked about in past videos had such a common denominator with personnel. He's currently the United States Special Representative for Venezuela. So, I'm going to bring in some quotes from a guy named Alfred de Zayas. He's a human rights investigator for the UN. He's the first one who represents the UN to go to Venezuela in the last 21 years. So the last time someone went to Venezuela with the title UN Investigator of Human Rights, that was right when the Chavez regime began, or maybe it was right before. He's written this guy Desires. He's written 13 reports for the Human Rights Council, but this one, for some reason or another, was flat out ignored by Western media. It's a scoop most journalists would die for. To get any of this crazy, fresh intel from such a legitimized person focusing on one of the most relevant countries in the news, all the while nobody in his position has checked out the relevant subject in over 2 decades. It's absolutely amazing to me. Journalists weren't, paying this guy off to talk to him first, if they're really seeking to inform the public. This is what he had to say, though. Quote, if you know a humanitarian crisis in Gaza and in Yemen and in Syria and in Sudan and Somalia, you wouldn't say there's a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. And at no point when I was walking the streets in Venezuela did I feel threatened, or did I see violence, or did I consider that this country was undergoing a humanitarian crisis. But I see human rights more and more being instrumentalized to destroy human rights. There is a weaponization of human rights. I see the rule of law being instrumentalized to destroy the rule of law and, unfortunately, the complicity of the mainstream media. What I'm saying to you I think it would have been sensible to say it to the BBC. It would have been sensible to say it to the New York Times, to the Washington Post, and to the Economist, and to the Financial Times, but at no time since I returned from Venezuela, and since my report was officially presented to the Human Rights Council, have I been approached by any of these organs who actually have a responsibility vis-a-vis you, and vis-a-vis me, and vis-a-vis the people of the United States to inform. Another quote, which was probably like 20 seconds later. Quote, "The solution of the problem is much easier than the band-aid of sending some packages or of food or of medicine. The solution is in my report. What I told the Human Rights Council is that the financial blockade has had extremely adverse human rights impacts. Obviously, the origin of the current economic crisis is in the dramatic fall in the price of oil. But normally, you'd be able to fix that. A country as wealthy as Venezuela should have been able to borrow money on its enormous natural resources. And then it would have been able to buy and sell just like anybody else. But no, the United States has made sure that because of the threat of enormous penalties to the U.S. Treasury, the banks have been closing the accounts of the Venezuelan government and the Petróleos of Venezuela. Already in July 2017, Citibank unexpectedly decided without prior notice and arbitrarily to close the bank accounts of the central bank account of Venezuela and the Bank of Venezuela in November 2017. Again, Citibank blocked the transfer for a shipment of more than 300,000 doses of insulin, which makes no sense. In November 2017, the company Euroclear retained $1.65 billion that the Venezuelan government had paid for the purchase of food and medicine. Citgo, the Venezuelan state oil company based in the U.S., has not been able to transfer its profits outside of the United States, and it needs that money to buy food and medicine. And it is in the neighborhood, I think, by now of $9 or $10 billion that have been withheld. That's from Citgo. There again, Wells Fargo Bank withheld and canceled payment of $7.5 million made by Brazil to Venezuela for the sale of electricity. In May 2018, the Venezuelan Minister of People's Power informed that a financial transaction amounting to $7 million for the purchase of dialysis supplies for patients, including children and adolescents requiring such treatments, have been blocked. And that's the end of that second Desaias quote. And here's the last Desaias quote. We're pretty much done with Desaias after this. Quote, "There's personal criminal liability for the impact of these sanctions. I am certain that the increase in child mortality, the increase in maternal mortality, the increased deaths for lack of insulin and or lack of antiretroviral drugs is a direct result of this blockage, so that Venezuela had not been able to purchase what its people deserve. It's not like the government doesn't want to distribute, it's that the government is being, through an external economic war, asphyxiated. And that is the name of the game. What the United States intended to do was to create a situation whereby the people or the military would topple the government. And then the 1% could again come in and gain control the wealth of Venezuela. Venezuela has succeeded in bringing millions and millions of Venezuelans out of extreme poverty. Nobody cared in the 1980s and 90s that there were millions of Venezuelans dying of hunger and malnutrition. No one cared. It was a government that was palatable to Washington and a government that was a right-wing government. The moment that a left-wing government came in power, priority number one in Washington was to topple it." End quote. So that's a lot. I hope you took all that in. Yeah, that's the end of Desaias. So people call Maduro a dictator just like they called Chavez a dictator. Only this time the accusations have some more grounding in them. The outgoing Chavista majority in the National Assembly, which is basically Congress, in 2015 elected new Supreme Court justices, and they held Chavista interests. Western media immediately piled on this story, screaming to the heavens about Maduro's evil cult of personality. Like, oh, he's a real piece of shit for this one. He's trying to sweep across the branches and have absolute power. Yeah, it's not that great that the outgoing Chavista majority elected, you know, Supreme Court justices with their interests, but it makes complete sense that those were the people they would elect. There's not exactly common courtesy values in the United States to elect people who don't have your interests. This is politics. Some things matter to people. And keep in mind, their Supreme Court justices don't even have permanent seats in Venezuela. They have, according to Article 264 of the Bolivarian Constitution, non-renewable 12-year terms, and 13 justices' terms were up before the National Assembly members left. Basically, the narrative was Maduro moved these justices out of power. And that's just completely not true. Everyone in Venezuela knows that these terms were up, and, you know, so does the opposition. They definitely know that. They were just mad that new ones got elected that didn't hold their interests, and so either they or the media just made up that Maduro did this, and it's completely dishonest. It's just flat out lying. They made it up. But yeah, no one is called a dictator in the United States because there really isn't a reason to believe it, even though elections like this happen all the time. Like, I'm pretty sure Bush did this. W. Bush. What's his face? H.W. Bush pardoned a bunch of people right before he left. People who held his interests. No one called him a dictator. But nonetheless, all this stuff is actually reversible, even though it's admittedly kind of hard to do. It can happen, but I mean, who the hell wants this stuff to happen all the time? It's hard. It's hard to do this stuff. It's hard to do a lot of this stuff in the United States, too. But yeah, under Article 265 of the Constitution, judges may be removed by a 2/3 majority of the National Assembly if the Attorney General, the Comptroller General, and Human Rights Ombudsperson have previously agreed a, quote, serious failure and suspended the judge accordingly. This didn't happen. The opposition party coalition called the MUD did win 2/3 of the seats. They apparently just didn't have the other position's approval to take those elected justices out of power. You know, too fucking bad, right? There's a separation of power, and that's a good thing to them, right? Apparently not, because they tried swearing in 3 members that the Supreme Court suspended for alleged voter fraud, and they have the power to do that. And they didn't want to wait for the suspension process, so they just tried swearing them in anyway. As a result, along the lines of Article 334 of the Constitution, the new National Assembly was in contempt of court, and legislative powers were temporarily turned over to the Supreme Court, the branch of government that wasn't committing crimes. Time for another claim of, you know, the big dictator man, even though it was other people's, you know, total screw up. And, you know, time for America's most trusted outlets such as NBC, CBS, CNN, and all those other, you know, just flat out liars to purposely twist this story and push a pro-war narrative. Dictator is an easy thing to throw around, especially if you focus on a different culture. Really, though, the new National Assembly had the opportunity to make real change in their favor. And even without those 3 new members, they would have had a gargantuan amount of power. They had 2/3 of 167 people in the National Assembly. So they had over 100 members. But for some reason, they still decided to go and blatantly, you know, move against the Constitution. Nobody in their right mind would think they could just get away with this in America if they just went against a ruling made by the Supreme Court. It wouldn't just breeze by, especially if the ruling was a suspension from being sworn into Congress made exclusively towards your name. The new assembly did it anyway, so their power was checked. They faced the consequences, and after this, The then ceremonial National Assembly tried creating their own Supreme Court, which was rejected by the Ombudsman, Tariq Saab, saying the new Supreme Court would not be recognized by the government. This is all within the Constitution. Maybe because the National Assembly made blatantly illegal motions to gain power, and this new Supreme Court would be representative of that same criminal assembly. And there was already a democratically elected Supreme Court. So to say that you're fighting for democracy when you're siding with the opposition, that's just not true. If you side with the opposition, you're just kind of flat out not a Democrat. If you're calling for intervention in a country that has only followed democratic values, of course, they don't say they follow democratic values, they just lie a whole bunch. Either way, though, according to Article 280 of the Constitution, the ombudsperson has power to decide a new Supreme Court's legitimacy, and he decided that that's not it's not legitimate. But yeah, so this next thing's a whole thing with Article 280. Probably just don't want to get into that. It's in the transcript. Now, let's get to the National Assembly. Let's just sum up what can be done with the whole National Constituent Assembly thing. In this case, it takes the place of the National Assembly, the legislative branch, and the legislative branch. Article 347 is basically like what you can do with the Constituent Assembly. The people of Venezuela is the original constituent power rests, and exercising this power may convene a National Constituent Assembly in order to transform the state, create a new law, and draft a new constitution. Article 348, the initiative calling a National Constituent Assembly can be made by the President of the Republic and Council of Ministers, the National Assembly by resolution of the 2/3 of its members, the municipal courts by a vote of 2/3 of them, and 15% of registered voters and voters in the civil and electoral registry. So lots of people can do this, including the president. And he was the one who actually called on this, and here comes people calling him basically Stalin again. Even though he's following his own constitution that's been around for 20 years, it's never really changed. And people kind of still love Chavez. They kind of really liked what was going on for a long time. And a lot of people were really lied to by, kind of a right-wing monopolized Venezuelan media. Basically, an American media in Venezuela. But yeah, the Constituent Assembly was the vote was called for by Maduro. The people vote on it, and a vote was made, and every seat was won by the United United Socialist Party of Venezuela, because Maduro is a dictator. Every seat was won because he's a dictator. Actually, no, because the opposition decided to boycott the election, all of a sudden saying the election was rigged. The Western media flipped the hell out about this, saying Maduro's a dictator. We totally knew it. They say this even though the opposition could have called on UN observers to come forth and do their job. They're out there. Can they really be doing things that often? They gave up their power, essentially, even though moves were made constitutionally to keep the rule of law in check. All they had to do was refrain from swearing in 3 measly members, and they would have had their opposition power in government. Also, they never really gave a reason for anybody to believe the election was rigged. They just said that it was. There's also a guarantee in Article 350 that the government should not violate human rights or democratic values, or the people can disown their regime. And, well, of course, this term human rights is not exactly clearly defined in the Constitution, but it does have a clear definition in a broader international field of play. And Maduro doesn't check out on that. He doesn't fit that definition. If the lies were true, maybe, but no, it's just not true. If by democratic values, though, they mean the democracy their constitution was founded on. They've pretty much strictly followed their constitution to a T. As for the opposition, you can just look at the swearing in of Guaido as the interim president to see a lack of constitutionality. This person who replaces a so-called corrupt leader is always supposed to be the vice president. It's just the opposition wouldn't get what they want if the Chavista vice president replaced Maduro, so that's not the route they chose. Maduro's election last year was allegedly fraudulent too, despite no data being shown to support the claim. So, if you've ever heard of Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, he has this organization called the Carter Center, which has in past Venezuelan elections teamed up with the Organization of American States and the UN Development Program. His organization says their elections are some of the most vetted elections in the world. Like, they have fingerprints, they audit, like, any vote they see as, looking sus. It's supposedly pretty dang good. And the opposition won the election, the same election process 2 years before. So the opposition, 2 months before the national election, told the UN not to send observers to oversee the national election. Maduro did ask for them to come. So, what more is there to say about that? The opposition boycotted the election. They boycotted this election too, saying the election was rigged, even though the process is, the same one. The coalition won like 2 years ago. Some have said that all of the most high-profile opponents were barred, and they were. The high-profile ones were barred. And these people included Enrique Capriles, Leopoldo Lopez, Antonio Ledesma, Freddy Guevara, David Smolansky, Maria Corina Machado, and Miguel Rodriguez Torres. Let me just tell you a little about each of these 7 people. Capriles, according to the LA Times in 2017, in a Tuesday tweet, he seemed to encourage police, the National Guard, and soldiers to mutiny and resist the government's orders to restrain protesters. And Lopez played a role in the coup in 2002 and played a role in starting violent protests where dozens of people died in 2014. That was after the 2013 election. Ledesma was arrested in 2015 and charged with having a major role in planning a U.S.-backed coup against Maduro. Ledesma also has a pretty dark past that I'll talk about later. Guevara has called people into the streets, according to Drexel professor and scholar George Chicharello Mar. He says Guevara called people into the streets to, quote, essentially engage in combat against the government. Smolansky falsely claimed on Twitter there was a chemical weapons attack from Maduro. This was debunked by national and international outlets. Nobody was affected, even though Smolansky took pictures of smoke and said the chemical would make one lose balance, vomit, and lose their sight. This didn't happen to anybody. Corina Machado was accused of plotting to kill the president. There was a series of emails found, supposedly, linking many opposition members and U.S. officials to the plot. One anonymous expert cited by the Daily Motion said the emails were faked. Take that one expert with as much salt as he can. I can't really be sure about this one, really. And there's not much certainty to the allegations. I can't really draw a conclusion. Lastly, there's Rodriguez Torres, whose arrest could very well be arbitrary, and because of his tenure with the Bolivarian government and his eventual descent. You know, maybe he was arrested arbitrarily. He was arrested and maybe or maybe not indicted for trying to divide the armed forces of the country. This might as well be a fuck up on Maduro. I'm not exactly sure again. There isn't really any follow up news on this kind of stuff. Overall, though, there have been some very legitimate reasons for barring many of these people from running. It's clear the government wasn't just out to suppress any sort of opposing forces. Most of these people are really bad. There's really no reason to believe the election was fraudulent either. And, okay, on to food shortages, the big one. One of the big ones. Okay, so food shortages are really not the government's fault. Private companies have cut the supply of food and other goods to then raise prices, and this of course causes inflation. Al Jazeera says the idea of hoarding has bipartisan belief. They say in a subhead, quote, as bizarre as it may seem in a country with the world's largest oil reserves, all agree food hoarding is a real problem, end quote. That's Al Jazeera. That's Western media right there. I mean, it's not like geographically Western, but it really is some Western kind of crap. Could this be accomplished completely by corporations? Probably. They own pretty much all of the food industry in Venezuela, and the industry is run by a few companies. So I mean, you only have like a few people making all these decisions for a whole country. I mean, it's pretty possible. None of it's owned by the state, though. None of it. Why would these companies do this? Why would they hide their supply from the people when these people are who these private companies rely on to make their cash? The thing is, the Venezuelan people aren't the only people they can turn to make their money. And sometimes people from other countries can make them much more money, so they export. Why can't the Venezuelan people make them as much money? Well, Chavez put price controls on goods, so then people could have a much easier time buying what they need. And that's pretty great. And it's actually pretty logical. It's a pretty logical solution to working class problems in a vacuum. The thing is, though, they're not in a vacuum. They're in a highly revisionist, social democratic country. So capitalists have some power, actually a lot of power, and they're going to use and abuse that power when necessary. That's kind of what they did. Due to these price ceilings, these corporations start knowingly causing inflation by hoarding and exporting, starting an internal economic war and a black market, which undercuts the real market, starving people until they buy from that black market or go to, quote, bread lines, or they can get much more affordable government subsidized food. And then the whole situation for Maduro ends up looking completely terrible because bread lines, I mean, God, bread lines are the all-time worst thing you can have to Americans. And the media will just crush it with, and look, bread lines. Good job, guys. And then it's just like, fuck. But yeah, this is exactly what happened, and it's very similar to what happened in Chile with capital flight. The bourgeoisie couldn't stand to see people receive a more social share, so they, in Chile's case, fled to another country. In Venezuela's case, they hoard food, and they export it for higher prices. And that's all on them, not the socialist or social democratic government. For real, though, that's why you don't have a social democracy. This stuff happens every time. But yeah, the people running these food corporations can feed themselves just fine. And they have no problem with creating shortages and watching people starve. And it's kind of the same way sanctions won't be lifted until Maduro is out of power. Those sanctions affect people more than anybody. They affect the people more than anybody. So what is basically said is, we care more about you being out of power than watching people starve. Yeah, it's pretty fucked up. But yeah, when people say price controls cause inflation, they do, I guess. but that's only because somebody else out there in the market is a total bastard. Fuck markets. They cut the supply or export it, leaving the current amount of money representing less, which means you need more money to buy things. The value of the money goes down. That's inflation. They act like Maduro can stop it whenever, and he hasn't done that great of a job trying to stop it. I mean, the dude kind of just printed some more money one time, which was really stupid. But I mean, either way, it's just not that simple. If he stopped the price controls and stayed in power, the companies would simply have the freedom to move the price as high as they want. And we've already seen how far they'll go to make their profits, which is about as far as they can go. For example, before price controls were set on electronic goods, quote, Maduro said government inspectors found goods that were overpriced by as much as 1,000%. That's according to BBC. And okay, so the author of this New York Times bestseller book, Republican Gomorrah, Max Blumenthal. This guy, remember his name. He's kind of coming up. He's up. He's already up. He got intel from workers in a Caracas supermarket when he went on what was pretty much a shopping spree. The supermarket was completely filled, and it's not that he came in with a schedule of the shipments in his hand or anything. He just showed up, and nobody came with him except his camera person. One of the pharmacy workers said speculation was a contributor to the high prices in goods. This is a purely capitalist phenomenon, for those who don't know. High prices lead to a cut in demand, which leads to lower supply, which leads to more inflation. Right. The level of inflation depends on how much the supply is cut, though. Blumenthal pulled up a bag of dog food, though, which costs up to 66,000 bolivars, which is over $20, at least at the time, which sort of speaks for the variance of buying power of Venezuelans' money. You can feed a whole family for much less than $20. A bag of dog food is $20. Dog food doesn't cost $20 here. Speculation causes those weird price variances, is what I'm saying. Another video of Blumenthal's shows him at the state-subsidized food market where people come to get food at much lower prices than the supermarkets. And large loaves of bread are there for less than $1 each when switching from bolivars. One woman in the video is seen with just a backpack full of food, showing how affordable it is, at least for her. Blumenthal, in a UN hearing, also cites the CLAP program, CLAP, which gives 12-cent food packages. And those packages hold 1 to 2 weeks worth of food. This takes care of over 6 million Venezuelans, and they're now increasing the prevalence from once a month to twice a month. So you're either getting a half month's worth of food for 12 cents or a whole month's for like 24 cents, or at the most 48 cents for the whole month. Another video shown in the UN hearing where Max Blumenthal spoke. Same with Alfred Desaias. He was there with him. It shows a man responding to the question of whether it's fair to call this situation a humanitarian crisis. He says, quote, well, basically a humanitarian crisis doesn't exist. There's a crisis of the distribution of food. There's a crisis of speculation of the cost of food, but there is food. You can get them, but the prices do not let you, end quote. So really, shortages aren't exactly an issue, at least according to this guy who was, it seemed like he's in a pretty poor area. It definitely wasn't Caracas where, I mean, Max Blumenthal was, where, I mean, you had all this, like, just crazy architecture and all these nice looking stores and like all these well-dressed people. These were not, like, definitely not people from, it just doesn't look like the same place. So there's poor people just like any other Just like people in the United States, people go hungry. They definitely go hungry, and there's definitely plenty of hungry people. There's a bunch of kids suffering from malnutrition, but there's never been any number released that shows anybody dying of hunger. I mean, that would be completely exploited by the media, right? They would definitely talk about that if there were people dying of hunger. They would just if there was pictures out there, they would definitely have those out there, but there aren't any. And so the food shortage thing is, like, I hate to say it, but a big lie. The American backed government before let millions of people die of hunger. No one said anything. I had never heard of him until, like, I watched a couple of videos. It's just like, shit. But now this guy's bad. But yeah, people are saying, like, there's like record numbers of like children with severe malnutrition, and that is just not true. Huge lie, like Titanic lie. The prior regime holds that record. They have their foot stomped on the neck of that record. It's just sky high compared to what's going on now. So here's another thing about Venezuela's food. It has to do with Chavez. And this is something that wasn't as good about Chavez. Chavez, when the economy was doing well, started relying much more on imports, and the economy shifted much towards their national oil industry. So they basically undiversified their economy. But they were doing well. This lack of diversification of the economy, though, is totally partly to blame for the lack of self-sufficiency in Venezuela. But, like Desaias said earlier, other countries would easily be able to rely on borrowing, and they should have been able to because of their massive abundance of oil. They have the largest oil reserves in the world. It's just a little bit more expensive to get it in Venezuela because it's harder to dig up. But, I mean, once the U.S. gets a hold of that, I'm sure they can handle that just fine. But, they could have made up for the borrowing when oil prices went back up. But of course, as revealed by John Bolton in an interview where he said Venezuelan oil would help the U.S. economy if the government was turned over, the United States would apparently rather take all of the Venezuelan oil than just some of it in exchange for some borrowed money. This lack of ability to borrow money turns what would usually be a minor mistake by a country with rich oil reserves into a catastrophe because of Chavez's changes. So basically, the situation was purposely made worse. Their situation was subject to sabotage. People are selling food across the border to turn a profit. That's just pretty fucking... That's sabotage. Like, there's all this kind of just external sabotage going on with their food. So really, the shortages aren't the Bolivarian government's fault at all. They should have been able to quickly and swiftly make up for any mistakes made. But they were given absolutely no chance when they had so much room for chances to be given. Alright, so next section. And this is about the aid. Yeah, okay, good stuff. So, Maduro's not turning down aid. He turned down U.S. aid. Aid was accepted by from the Red Cross, China, and Russia. They just didn't accept it from the United States because they have had a clear malevolent presence towards the Bolivarian government in the past 2 decades. So, I mean, they've just burnt their trust. The bridge that was shown to be blocked off by the Bolivarian government was actually a bridge, like, in case you saw it in, like, you know, like NBC or whatever, there are these giant, like, shipping containers and then, like, an oil tanker truck, like, a trailer, they were just blocking the bridge. And the thing is, they're like, oh, they're trying to prevent aid from coming in, and this is the extent they're trying to go to. How just draconian or whatever, just completely terrible. The thing is, this bridge was never opened, or at least it's not open right now. Yeah, that's why they're there. There was an issue with smuggling, and they blocked it. I mean, not that hard to fact check. The supposed aid provided by the United States via the Colombian-Venezuelan border on that other bridge, it wasn't the same bridge. The supposed aid that was set on fire by the opposition. Yeah, it was set on fire by the opposition, who was supposed to be trying to get the aid in, according to the New York Times. They said that CNN got this wrong when CNN said Maduro, or not Maduro, like the pro-government thugs, they're police. They said the police set fire to the aid when there's no witnesses that say that. There's video evidence showing the opposition doing this, but they haven't even made like a retraction yet. Of course not. But yeah, then as shown by the Venezuelan foreign minister at the UN Security Council meeting this March, there were nails and razors in said burnt truck, the one that was burnt by the opposition, and the supplies weren't there, the supposed supplies that were inside the truck. And honestly though, why offer aid when Britain could simply give back the $1 billion in gold, and the United States could let Citgo's profits go to Venezuela? Why should any sort of US aid be trusted as long as they're imposing economic sanctions which leave the country, practically crippled? It's completely contradictory, as the sanctions they've had a direct impact on Venezuelans, and relieving sanctions would arguably bring much more aid to the people than literally invading the country with these trucks. Be much easier. So, I mean, after the aid was burnt, right? They didn't send more, and they didn't relieve the sanctions. So where's your aid? They don't care. The president there's claims that moving on from the aid thing, the president supposedly inadequately funded the Guri Dam, leaving many people without sufficient supply of electricity. So yeah, that whole dam just crapped the shitter like last week or like 2 weeks ago, and 70% of the country was like without electricity for like 2 days or 3 days maybe. But here's the freaking kicker. The dam is not government funded. It is private owned. Why the hell should Maduro be held in any way responsible for this? Much less be held more accountable for the blackout than the owners of the company or the owners of the dam. If they hold the resources available to provide the service, like, they should be able to run it just fine. But apparently they didn't. Why the hell are they running it? The government sure as hell can't do anything about it, though, because of the sanctions. They can't fund it. They can't maintain it on their own. They had a whole shipment of electricity blocked. Brazil didn't block it, but it was coming from Brazil. It was blocked. What are they supposed to do? There were cyber attacks on the dam too, the night before the power outage. Few suspects can truly be thought of, as there's little reason to attack a dam other than just pure sabotage. So electricity definitely has been an issue. It's been happening for years, and this opportunity for a coup has been, or just an uprising in general, has been suggested for as long as 15 years, according to documents released by WikiLeaks over 7 years ago. Only this time, cyber attacks and near simultaneous exploding of sites, or I guess subsequent exploding of sites, may have been what sped things up. Maduro said the government had tracked cyber attacks from both Houston and Chicago. According to WikiLeaks, though, the emails date between July 2004 and late December 2011. They reveal the inner workings of a company that fronts as an intelligence publisher, but provides confidential intelligence services to large corporations such as Bhopal's Dow Chemical Co., Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and government agencies including the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Marines, and the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. The emails show Stratfur's web of informers, payoff structure, payment laundering techniques, and psychological methods. All right, here's a part of an email. Quote, a key to Chavez's current weakness is the decline in the electricity sector. There is the grave possibility that some 70% of the country's electricity grid could go dark as soon as April 2010. Water levels at the Guri Dam are dropping, and Chavez has been unable to reduce consumption sufficiently to compensate for the deteriorating industry. This could be the watershed event, as there is little that Chavez can do to protect the poor from the failure of that system. This would likely have the impact of galvanizing public unrest in a way that no opposition group could ever hope to generate. At that point in time, an opposition group would be best served to take advantage of the situation and spin it against Chavez towards their needs. Alliances with the military could be critical because in such a situation of massive public unrest and rejection of the presidency, malcontent sectors of the military will likely decide to intervene, but only if they believe they have sufficient support. This has been the pattern of the last 3 coup attempts. Where the military thought it had enough support, there was a failure in the public to respond positively, or the public responded in the negative, so the coup failed. This wasn't even the only thing that happened to the country's infrastructure that day. I thought that was part of the quote, but it's not. Just screw off. Just forget that I said it. That last sentence there. So yeah, the dam thing. That outage wasn't even the only thing to happen that day. There, like I said, there was like subsequent substations and oil tanks that exploded. The oil tanks held a diluent, which is mixed with Orinoco Belt crude oil to make it lighter, according to Jose Brito. So they're definitely big parts of Venezuelan infrastructure. It's, really, really suspicious that all this just now happened. Oh yeah, like I said, there was a big block from the electrical power shipment, and that was by Wells Fargo. I wasn't completely sure when I was saying that, but yeah, Wells Fargo did that. In the New York Times, this is a big one. You know how people were talking about the backup generators, they weren't available to the hospitals, so that people going on dialysis died. Well, the New York Times reported that backup generators could not be used because of a lack of fuel due to U.S. sanctions. And so a bunch of people on dialysis died. They made a huge deal about this, even though there's a whole bunch of a bunch of dialysis supplies being blocked. Like specifically dialysis supplies for some reason, which is, you know, they totally exploited that one. They jumped on that opportunity, I guess. It's just ridiculous. Just big lie again. And that's coming from an expert. Like, that claim of blocking is coming from an expert. It's not like someone just said this and it's like, then they're out here exploiting the fact that people are dying, like when they're like a bunch of dialysis patients are dying. It's bullshit. All right, next one. Maduro doesn't just jail anybody who opposes him, and allegations of torture have never really been substantiated. I've never seen any kind of like substantiating like or corroborating evidence to support the torture hypothesis, so I'm not going into it. But yeah, Guaido, he's just fine. He left the country, came back, and he's just fine. Not arrested. He's free to go anywhere. He talks to people every day. The United States Department openly lied about how the military, quote, defied Maduro in order to let Guaido back in the country. But they actually obeyed Maduro's orders to let him back in peacefully. They completely lied about what happened when there's no reason for this sort of misinterpretation. They just made it up. The opposition members who have been arrested are actually pretty crazy batshit criminals who tried to violently take over the country. Like I said, Leopoldo Lopez and the other guy, Ledesma. These are the guys I'm talking about. They did this, and they've collectively caused thousands of deaths. Yet people believe they're such great people. One of them is nicknamed Venezuela's Nelson Mandela, which is just like, no. They're both responsible for like just really bad happenings. Imagine if we let somebody like the guy who tried to shoot Reagan assume power in any manner whatsoever. Nobody in the US would support that. Like, maybe like 200 people would be like, yeah, that's a good idea. And then the other half of that 200 would be like, but he has like no political past. And guess what? Guaido has none either. He has no political past. Yeah. Here's a quote from Minpress News. Western media have described Leopoldo Lopez, a politician who has a dark history of inciting violent protests, as the, quote, Venezuelan Nelson Mandela. But they've ignored the facts surrounding his recent arrest, as well as that of fellow opposition leader Antonio Ledesma. Lopez often receives praise in the Western media as a prisoner of conscience, a fiery leader, and the Venezuelan Nelson Mandela. He's widely perceived as the international face of the Venezuelan opposition. But according to leaked U.S. diplomatic cables, even, quote, for the opposition parties, Lopez draws ire second only to Chavez. The only difference between the two is that Lopez is a lot better looking, end quote. The U.S. Department officials have called Lopez, quote, arrogant, vindictive, and power-hungry, end quote. Lopez's political past is quite dark, enough so that he himself has sought to distance himself from some of his past actions, namely his active role while mayor of Caracas, wealthiest district, Chacao, in the 2002 U.S.-backed failed coup against then-President Chavez. Years later, in 2014, Lopez co-led the effort to opportunistically take advantage of student marches commemorating Venezuela's National Youth Day. He was later arrested for his role in encouraging the violence. Prior to becoming mayor, Ledesma supported the 2002 failed coup and had a role similar to that of Lopez's in stirring up violent protests in 2014 and claimed dozens of lives. However, the Ledesma Uh, Ledesma is most notorious for having directed state troops to violently quell the 1989, I don't know how you say this, Caracazo uprising, while serving as federal district governor of Caracas. As many as 4,000 civilians are believed to have been killed by the state police in the uprising. Ledesma was initially arrested in 2015 and charged with having a major role in planning a US-backed coup to oust Maduro. Alright, next section. Guaido, even if he has legitimacy brought by the people after his faux inauguration, his place as president is unconstitutional, which is contrary to what corporate media claims, because they've lied again. If Maduro is to be replaced by another as interim president in a constitutional manner, it has to be the vice president. The current vice president is Delcy Rodriguez. After that, there has to be a new election within 30 days, and Guaido is far surpassed that 30 days by like a month. Maduro, I will admit, every day of the week, doesn't seem to be the most qualified guy for the position. The United Socialist Party, the pro-Chavistas, didn't quite think so either before the last election. They were pretty close to picking somebody else to run, but they chose Maduro. What I won't admit is that he's a dictator and that he deserves to be overthrown. He really does deserve his spot as president, and he's done a hell of a job fighting off all of these terrible lies. This is another operation by the United States, or even the CIA, and it's to exploit the resources of the land, just like the other oil wars, and just like the other campaigns to overthrow leaders in Latin America. But let's sum this up. What have we found? L.A. Abrams, a man who has had a notorious past with during Latin American coups. Let me start over. L.A. Abrams, a man who has had a notorious past during Latin American coups and the last Venezuelan coup, is now a part of this U.S.-led coup. He's caused bloody massacres from death squads in many countries before, and there's really no reason to believe him almost 70 years after he started. There's actually never been a reason to believe him in the past 30 years, considering his lying to Congress about the Iran-Contra affair. They just kind of forgave him and then let him back on some of the highest positions a person can hold. It's just mind-numbingly and insultingly suspicious. Just how many times are you going to fall for the same goddamn trick? The UN human rights investigator found contrary evidence to his preconceived notion. He walked into Venezuela thinking that it was going to be like fucked up. He walked in with a preconceived notion there were human rights violations being made by the Bolivarian government and Maduro, but he now believes there's a campaign by the United States to overthrow Maduro by creating a situation that will get him overthrown. He cites a massive number of blocks from corporations for different kinds of aid and purchases, including but not limited to food, medicine, and electricity. This all runs contrary to the supposed care for the Venezuelan people. He was so coincidentally ignored by the Western media too. I mean, he wasn't even ignored before. People call Maduro a dictator all the time, even though every time he's been perceived as some sort of evil asshole, he's actually following the law in what he does, and is often trying to uphold the rule of law, and the opposition is trying to follow suit in some illegal or undemocratic chain of decisions, such as swearing in suspended elects, making a second unrecognized Supreme Court then that they can continue to use. They boycott elections without any analysis of the actual election process, and claiming Maduro unjustly bar the best of the opposition for no reason when there's plenty of reasons, then they have the nerve to call upon the masses to rise up against the guy who has their interests in mind. Maduro and Chavez really aren't the ones responsible for the crisis going on. Any mistakes they made they should have been easily made up for. They should have easily been made up for if they were, the neoliberal regime the U.S. wanted. There's an internal economic war, though. There's an economic war. It involves hoarding, exporting, in the black market, which all cause inflation because the legal market has lessened supply and the black market's selling what would be legal goods. All the while, there are still resources available. They're just at high prices on the market because of, speculation and inflation. Even many Venezuelans say this. They are available, though, at much lower prices from the government, though the masses... they're at much lower prices from the government, though, and the masses have great access to these goods. Like, there's not just... You don't hear about people being like, oh, they ran out of food at the government-subsidized market. That would be totally exploited. A wide range of outlets have claimed Maduro turned down aid, which is the most obvious lie they've told. It takes 2 seconds to figure out they've accepted aid from the Red Cross, China, and Russia. And that is aid, just not aid from the U.S., which has only shown hate toward the Venezuelan people and their elected government. There was also blatant fake news about the blocked off bridge that just wasn't opened yet. Then there was another set of blatant fake news with the burning truck where razors and nails were found. Then there's the point to be made that if sanctions were simply lifted, nobody would have to literally invade Venezuela to get the aid there, or supposed aid. And then there's the whole thing about the dam. It's not government funded, so they don't deserve accountability. There were also cyber attacks from Houston and Chicago, then subsequent suspicious explosions at substations and oil fields. This outage just wasn't a big old coinky-dink. Considering the realization this outage would be a huge opportunity over 10 years ago by an intelligence firm that gives intel to Homeland Security and Lockheed Martin. Wells Fargo blocked $7 million in electricity. The New York Times reported sanctions prevented the backup electric generators from being fueled, showing the apparent apathy until the news stories came. Maduro really, he doesn't just jail opposition leaders. A lot of these people have committed terrible crimes. Guaido is fine, and Maduro wanted it that way, contrary to what Western media claimed. The two arrested figures that so many people in the West hail as heroes are actually shitheads, and it doesn't take more than a Google search to figure that out. It took me minutes to find corroborating sources showing their crimes. And lastly, Guaido is going against the Constitution in claiming that he is president, or even interim president. The power goes to the vice president, not him. If Maduro is truly not representative of the people, you give the vice president power, and then there's an election. Believe it or not, there's an election after that. You don't just give them power. So after analyzing all of this situation, I believe Maduro is the legitimate president of Venezuela. I just do. If you have other stuff to say that contradicts what I say and isn't just from NBC, that's great. Please show it to me. But I think he deserves a spot, and he's done well at following the Constitution. He's obviously studied it enough to know when somebody's messing up or taking advantage, and he acts accordingly and legally. So I want to move on to the similarities between all of this and what's happened before. And this won't take long. We have
Elliot Abrams, who is basically a pro at all of this by now. He knows exactly what methods to use to disinform the people and manufacture consent to invade the country. We have the Western, and more specifically the United States media, relentlessly supporting action against Venezuela and create and feed the narrative of his supposed brutal dictatorship. They constantly lie, making up graphic details to appeal to emotion and paint the situation as black and white, and when it's very complex, just like every other situation. This is very similar to what went on with Operation Mockingbird, with the press being so geared towards anti-communist disinformation. I mentioned that a few videos back, and the fact that Venezuelan media is mostly monopolized by the opposition, it couldn't be far off to suggest the U.S. influence. There's U.S. influence or infiltration in that media. For instance, they often tout much of the same information as the U.S., and that draws comparison to the Radio Liberation in Guatemala, where David Atlee Phillips faked being Guatemalan and convinced many people in Guatemala there was a popular uprising and a brutal dictator when the United States just feared communism and wanted some land back. We have the shortages which occurred in Chile, in Allende's Chile, because of capital flight, which was definitely encouraged both internally and externally by the U.S. This is in relation to the exports or hoarding and creation of the black markets by the capitalist class to sabotage the economy. This is a tactic the United States has been a part of in the past, and it's likely a tactic they're a part of now, especially considering the sanctions. If they aren't, we know absolutely for sure that U.S. companies such as Wells Fargo are. They just are. And Citibank. I can't remember if Citibank's even American, but they're a part of that too. So if there isn't a covert U.S. influence behind the explicit support for the opposition, and all of this is some sort of, BS coincidence, I don't think my brain can go on functioning. I can't just sit by and watch all of these all-out, big-out lie stories, come out and say, yeah, that's totally consistent with the facts and numbers and the people on the ground, what the people on the ground are saying. If I said that, I would be completely dishonest with myself. Also, so many people go on without asking any of the hard questions. It just blows my mind to see people walk around like talking about Venezuela, like they heard they've heard one thing before, two things. They watched NBC once with their 2-minute time slots talking about Maduro. Brutal dictator Maduro, screws over his people again. He doesn't care about his people. And dude, when was the last time we actually cared about people? I mean, there's always some kind of ulterior motive when it comes to these claims. I mean, it's been revealed already on national television. It's just ridiculous that people can't see this already. There was an oil interest with Iraq, Afghanistan, and I don't know what the deal was with Libya, with I'm pretty sure they got oil too. They made Gaddafi look like he was a freaking crazy person. They made Saddam Hussein look like a crazy person when we actually had pretty good relations with them before, or at least Saddam Hussein. I'm not so sure about Gaddafi, but Gaddafi, try to find what he did wrong. Really not anything. And here is a whole country 10 years ago believing the media when they say brutal dictator Muammar Gaddafi ... They never said what he did. He suppresses dictators. What? So does everybody. I'm going off on a tangent here, but there's just so many similarities with all of this shit, and I want you all to see them. I want so badly for y'all to just see this. I have no idea how long I've been talking. This has to be like an hour long by now. But I kind of owed it to the subject. It's a very complex subject. It's very important. The United States is going to be a much more powerful economic power if we get all that oil. Screw that. I fucking can't stand what's going on. Oh shit. I'm just gonna let it be. It's about 12 o'clock. This shit's about to go down. And it's supposed to be going down at 12. So I've already passed the deadline for this. I have really nothing else in the transcript to talk about here. Let's see. Let's see if there's anything extra. Just watch out for oil prices staying low, I guess. Apparently we did that to the USSR. Reagan did that to the USSR to help with their collapse. It really wasn't the only thing that caused their collapse, but since Venezuela depends so much on oil, a tactic like that is very useful. Keep an eye on that. We have low oil prices right now. It's probably just going to stay that way. It seems easy enough to do. We have such a good relation with Saudi Arabia, so whatever us and them say goes, I guess. And that's the end of this video. This is Taste the Robot. This is the biggest video yet. Podcast of the century. 1,000 viewers at once. Gonna blow YouTube's servers up. They're gonna hassle me about this. So, catch y'all later. Maybe I'll talk about, Syria next time. Later.